So thank you very much for the introduction. I'm very happy to be here today to talk about my research and to get some feedback. So I'd like to thank the organising team for making this possible. So my talk is about New Year rituals in ancient Mesopotamia. So the main ambition of this talk is to show the relationship between economic phenomena on the one hand and theological discourse and ritual practice on the other. I want to defend a holistic way of looking at New Year rituals that is not just about theology and religion, not just about politics, but that also encompasses astronomical and socioeconomic phenomena. As my title suggests, I aim to show you how the New Year ritual was a moment when the political elite of these ancient empires was balancing stars, gods, depths, and social structures, how the new year was not solely a fundamental moment of balance and equilibrium of the cosmos, but that it was a fundamental moment for the equilibrium of the entire social fabric and political systems of ancient empires in the first millennium BCE. So, next slide, please. So my aim when I joined the COE Ancient Near Eastern Empires as a postdoc in Helsinki was to use social theory to try and shed new light on the New Year rituals that are attested in one form or another throughout the first millennium BCE. So we see here the different empires that succeeded each other and their territorial extent. I decided to approach them using Pierre Bourdieu's field theory and to try and understand the social representations, beliefs, and practices associated with New Year rituals in different fields of social life. I was interested in understanding the continuity of New Year rituals through the long time period, but also in understanding their shifts in the longue durée. So next slide, please. So this is a drawing. Actually, you can go to the next one quickly. I'm a bit embarrassed about the next one because it's a bit wild. So this is a drawing that shows the theoretical architecture of the research. So that's the roadmap that I've been following to explore these ancient rituals. So maybe you can go back to the previous one, which is a little less messy. Yes, wonderful. So I also like the idea put forward by the anthropologist Clifford Geertz of thick description of social phenomena, the idea of analysing the layers of meaning, like the different levels of an onion in a way. So my goal was to identify the different meanings that have been sedimented in this New Year ritual, to carry out like an archaeology of meaning, of discourse, to speak like Foucault. I do not restrict the analysis to meaning alone, because I believe you cannot understand the social representations or the meaning of social phenomena without looking into what people are actually doing, without looking into their practices, without looking into the flow of everyday life. And that, I think, is the whole point of sociology and anthropology and how they separated themselves from philosophy in the 19th century. But my ambition is not purely materialistic either. I do believe that economic phenomena are at the basis of wider social phenomena in society, of symbolism and religious phenomena, but I also insist that there is no such thing as purely economic phenomena. Economic phenomena itself is always simultaneously social, religious, and symbolic. So in a nutshell, I stay away from economic monism and believe that there's always a mutual influence between economic phenomena and symbolic production in a society. I see them in a constant feedback loop, in a dynamic relationship. So these layers, these fields that I distinguish here, are always in a constant dynamic relationship. The drawing, in a way, is just a simplification for the sake of the actual research process itself. I used it as a roadmap in a way. But you cannot actually study Mesopotamian astronomical theory and practice without talking about their mythology and ritual practice. And you cannot talk about the social structures of the economy without talking about the religious dimensions of agricultural production and about the way that the political systems of empires, the imperial administration, deeply interferes with the subsistence activity. As mentioned in my title, my main result here is that in every single layer, in every single field that I explored related to the new year, there is always one social representation and a set of practices that always emerges, that of equilibrium and balance. Equilibrium and balance of the celestial mechanics, equilibrium and balance of the social fabric, equilibrium and balance of the cosmic forces in their religious dimensions, and last but not least, equilibrium and balance of powers in the political system. So my hypothesis is straightforward. The new year of the first millennium BCE was a moment where the political elites of empires were balancing stars, debts, social structures and gods, and political systems. So these are my results, and the main ambition of my talk is to explain how I got to them. So next slide, please. So the roadmap for this talk is not the same as the one I followed in my research. For the sake of clarity, I need to proceed differently because you're not trained as a Assyriologist, and actually I'm originally not trained as an Assyriologist too. I do my best. So Assyriology is the name of the discipline that specializes in ancient Mesopotamian empires. And so I need to explain to you what these New Year rituals were and then point out what's new about my research. So we'll be looking at these two first fields, the religious and the political fields. I will present what these New Year rituals actually were, their mythical background and the ritual practice associated, and I'll give some general background historical information as to how and why this ritual came to exist and its place in the political field in the Babylonian and Assyrian empires. From then, we'll go off for a walk in the cosmos, looking at astronomical theory and practice, looking at calendars and intercalation practices. We'll then set foot back on Earth, in the fields and the pastures, and look at the ecological and socioeconomic dimensions of both agriculture and animal husbandry, exploring the social structures of the ancient economy, looking at rural usury, at land tenure, and configuration of the social fabric, and how the states intervened in it. We'll then zoom out and see how the exploration of the cosmos and of the socioeconomic phenomena sheds new light on the New Year ritual itself. So we're going to go from theology, ritual practice and politics to astronomical theory and practice and the analysis of socioeconomic phenomena. And then we're going to go back to theology, ritual practice and politics. Let's now jump into the description of New Year rituals in ancient Mesopotamia. Next slide, please. I think we're going to a map here so that we can follow a bit where we are. So there are attestations of many celebrations of the beginning of the year in different areas, time periods, and political contexts of ancient Mesopotamia. The first thing that we can say here is that there were a wide variety of calendars in use in ancient Mesopotamia throughout the different millennia. People didn't always mark the new year at the same moment, but the different celebrations were, however, always synchronized with astronomical phenomena. They take place around the equinoxes or around the solstices. Some societies had two beginnings of the year, so using the two equinoxes or the two solstices. Now, the crème de la crème of New Year rituals is, however, the Babylonian New Year ritual, because it's one for which we have the most sources, and it's the one that has been most extensively studied by Assyriologists, but also by the first generations of anthropologists like Fraser and by historians of religions like Mircea Eliade. The New Year celebration I will talk about here, those that take place in the first millennium BCE in the Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian Empire through the Persian Achaemenid and Seleucid empires, are all inspired by this Babylonian New Year. So before we start talking about celebrating the beginning of the year, we need to actually talk about the calendar itself. So we are setting the time machine back to the second millennium to BCE, so actually the 18th century BCE, to be more precise, the time of the King Hammurabi. In the 18th century BCE, the great Hammurabi, a big name that you must be familiar with, managed to extend his power and influence beyond the city of Babylon to a wider area, actually following in the footsteps of his predecessors. Hammurabi, who reigned between 1792 and 1750, is famous, of course, for his law code, which is thought to be one of the earliest forms of written law ever discovered. Now, there are many debates on the question of if and how these legal principles were really respected, but we need to pass on that. Hammurabi is thought to have received this law code from the god Shamash himself, the sun god, who was in charge of justice. The old Babylonian Empire extends north and incorporated at one point the city of Ashur, later to be the capital of the Neo-Assyrian Empire that we're going to be looking at in a moment. But we must say something here about the organization of political powers back then. We're dealing with a series of city-states, each having their king. So Hammurabi doesn't so much get rid of these existing political centers. He simply manages to become the king of their king in a way, turning them into vassals. Just like Babylon itself was one political center that had been integrated into different larger political systems headed by other kings. And Hammurabi's inscriptions enumerate the different political centers that were incorporated and insist that the new king will respect the existing cults and recognize their main divinities. Now, the extent of the territory controlled and the necessity to unify cultic activities and trade activities called for a unified calendar. According to some Assyriologists, it's at this point in time that we see one of the first unified calendars appear that's based on a calendar of the city of Nippur, which is an important religious center, but that also incorporated local traditions. And this calendar is known as the Babylonian calendar, or the standard Mesopotamian calendar. It had 12 months, and that's because of the movements of the moon, and the year begins around the spring equinox in month 1. The autumn equinox is also important and recognized sometimes as another beginning of the year, but it happens in month 7, so it's not month 1. Month 1 is the spring equinox. So this calendar was actually adopted. People really like this calendar. This calendar was actually adopted by the Middle Assyrian empires some centuries down the line. And then it was passed down to the Neo-Assyrian Empire, where the beginning of the year is also celebrated around the spring equinox. So in a nutshell, the calendar that was used in the first millennium by the Neo-Assyrian Empire and the ones after it is a Babylonian calendar that was put together and implemented in the second millennium to facilitate the administration of affairs in the time of Hammurabi. It had 12 months and it started at the spring equinox. So this is the calendar that they have, that the Neo-Assyrian Empire has, and that they're using in the first millennium, this standard Babylonian calendar. But what about the mythological aspects of the new year? Because now we know, right, they had this new year, and that the reason why they had the new year at the spring equinox is because they imported this Babylonian calendar that started at the spring equinox. But what about the mythology of this new year ritual? What's this all about? So the mythology that's central to the ritual that takes place at the new year is a text called the Enuma Elish, When Up High. That's the first lines of the compositions. The Enuma Elish, also known as the creation epic, tells us about how Marduk, the patron god of the city of Babylon, managed to rise from the status of normal god to that of the king of all the other gods around. Can we have the next slide, please? So here we see a depiction of Marduk here in the middle, from a later period, where we see him standing on some sort of dragon figure that, although seems to be wearing some sort of party hat, doesn't look too happy with the turn of events. Now, that dragon-like creature is Tiamat, mother of all the gods. Tiamat that Marduk manages to defeat, and a victory that earns him the position of chief of the pantheon. So at the beginning, even before the beginning of times, there was Tiamat and her consort. More than a dragon, she was originally associated with the sea and salted water. Now, Tiamat and her consort had their first lot of children that are called gods, so they were gods. But these children were noisy and agitated, and their parents started to be quite stressed out. And I think we can all relate here, but only up to this point, because it gets quite grim afterwards. The dad especially was gearing up a real anger towards them, and the noise was driving him so mad that he started making plans to get rid of them altogether. Tiamat was, of course, distraught by his rather radical intentions. Now, in the background of this narrative, other gods also appear in a rather confusing manner. But as the story unfolds, we have several generations of gods involved in this family drama. When the noisy and agitated gods hear what their father is plotting against them, they neutralize him. And when Tiamat hears that piece of news, she enters into a fit of rage. She stirs up major chaos. And her name is often associated with chaos and destruction. And this is when Marduk appears. He thinks he can take her down. But before he sets out, he makes sure that he gets an agreement with all the other gods that if he's able to defeat this Tiamat, dragon, this Tiamat, he would then rise as the major god of the pantheon. And well, he succeeds in both these missions, in cutting the deal with the gods and in defeating Tiamat. So this is where the actual creation of the world sequence starts. Marduk creates time. He creates the years, the months, the stars, and regulates the celestial mechanics. In the later sequence, the human beings are created from the blood of one of the rebellious gods that sided with Tiamat, which is a rather strange choice of ingredients from the blood of a rebellious god. Marduk is given a very special thing in the end of this myth, and that is the tablets of destiny, on which are written the fates of the land and of all the people. So basically, the Enuma Elish is all about how Marduk gets to be the main god. It's a story of family conflicts and tensions, a story of equilibriums that are broken, like one of those family Christmas meals that goes downhill, a story of chaos and then order, a story of creation of the world and harmony after a period of unrest and social turbulence. But when did this mythology appear in the area? When did this Enuma Elish myth that's central to the New Year ritual actually appear? Now, before answering this question, or struggling to answer this question, I need to say a word about how difficult it is to actually date Mesopotamian literature in general. Dating Mesopotamian literary work and understanding the relationship between mythological texts and political developments is not an easy task. There's what has been called a stream of tradition. Stories involving different deities were copied down for millennia and sometimes rearranged, with some sequence appearing and others disappearing. We also have new divinities that appear or are being equated with each other. Tablets are not always dated. They're often broken in the best parts. And of course, many tablets were badly excavated at the beginnings of archaeology, and many entered museum collections after being looted, so with no specified origin. So precisely dating Mesopotamian mythological texts and literature in general is a very tedious task. Even when the text is dated, or when precise archaeological context reveals a precise date, we do not know how long this specific text has been in the stream of tradition, because the date of the writing of an actual tablet doesn't always equate the date of its original composition, of course. One of the most efficient ways to date texts has been, of course, philological analysis. That is, to look at the grammatical structure and syntax of the text and to compare it with a wider corpus text, with a wider corpus of texts that are, in turn, precisely dated. Another way to date the epics is to look at their content. What does the epic talk about? In which time period would it have been relevant to talk about that? So the date of the composition of the Enuma Elish, this mythological text that's thought to be central to the New Year ritual, has been the object of numerous debates. I can't go into a lot of detail, but I mentioned some dates that have been advanced as possible candidates. Some Assyriologists suggest that it was composed in the Old Babylonian period at the time of the Hammurabi and the Standard Calendar. Other scholars, like the famous Lambert, think that the Enuma Elish was actually composed much, much later, 7 centuries down the line, during the Middle Babylonian period, in the reign of the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar I. So 1121. Lambert argues that it's when this Babylonian king managed to recover a statue of Marduk that had been godnapped by the Elamites. Godnapping was a thing. People kidnapped the statues of the gods to make their enemies cross. So Lambert argues that it's when this Babylonian king managed to recover a statue of Marduk that had been godnapped by the Elamites that the text was composed. Babylon had just gotten rid of Kassite domination, and the Kassite had installed their own gods at the top of the pantheon. So when the Kassites left, there was a vacuum up there. And with the return of the god Marduk to Babylon, timing was perfect to compose a text that would explain how he was placed all the way up there as head of the pantheon. Other scholars say that the return of the statue wasn't such a big deal anyway, and they cast doubts on Lambert's reading. And some actually said that the Enuma Elish, this myth, was only composed in the first millennium BCE. But what is certain is that the actual only existing copies of the Enuma Elish can all be dated to the first millennium. Their grammatical structure and the motifs place their original composition to the second millennium, but we actually have no copies of this myth dated to the second millennium. So let me just sum up what I've said until now. A standard Babylonian calendar that places the beginning of the year at the time of the spring equinox was adopted by the Babylonian kings in the first half of the second millennium. The Assyrian Empire adopted this Babylonian calendar at the end of the second millennium, so just before the first millennium that we're interested in. The mythology that is central to the Babylonian New Year ritual, this Enuma Elish, tells the story of how the Babylonian god Marduk won a cosmic battle and how this victory allowed him to become the chief of the pantheon. But what about the ritual? So we've talked about the calendar, we've talked about the myth. What about the ritual? So we saw that dating the Enuma Elish was a difficult task. Well, identifying exactly the Babylonian ritual associated with the Enuma Elish and that was celebrated at the spring equinox at the beginning of the year is actually just about as difficult. There are really 2 ways of looking at this, like in the matrix. Like you can take the blue pill or the red pill. There's a simple way or there's a more nuanced and complicated one. Next slide, please. So if you look at the Wikipedia page, bear with me, we find a rather precise description of what the ritual was in Babylon. And when you read Assyriological literature that's not precisely on the New Year, there's a tendency to always resort to the same monolithic description of the Babylonian New Year ritual. And that's the blue pill, and this is the story. The ritual was celebrated every year in Babylon around the time of the spring equinox and lasted for about 2 weeks. The ritual gathered many gods and the members of the higher classes of society, and the king played an active role. The ritual was the moment where his authority was legitimized again, where he was installed again as the rightful shepherd of the people. There was an Akitu temple located outside the city gates where the Enuma Elish was recited, and a cultic reenactment of the ritual of Marduk over Tiamat took place. Procession of the gods were organized and observed by the common people. Towards the end of the festivities, the gods gathered for the days of destiny and declared the fate of the land, the fate of the individuals, of all the people for the year to come. So that was the blue pill of Babylonian New Year rituals. That's the general idea, right? That's what's sort of repeated over and over again. Now let's see what the red pill has in stock for us. Next slide, please. Wonderful. So here, what exactly was going on in Babylon and in the wider area under Babylonian control in terms of ritual at the New Year is not so totally straightforward as the description that I just gave. The ritual I just described is the result of the lumping of the sources, as my colleague Céline Debourse shows in the Ph.D. on the Akitu of the Seleucid period. I.e., scholars have stitched together sources from different time periods to produce one smooth narrative. Now, let's enter into another set of troubling remarks. Now, the new year is also referred to as Akitu, and this term is used to describe the major rituals of other city gods that existed in the area. So not only Marduk, not only the Babylonian Marduk, but other gods also had their Akitus. And these Akitu celebrations involved offerings and processions. These Akitus brought together different gods, and there's some sort of circuit going on. Like you go to the Akitu in that city, and then you go to the Akitu in the other city. The town of Nippur, for instance, that had since then been long before important religious center and home of an older generation of gods like Enlil, has many attestations of Akitus. And newly published tablets do show that in the 13th century, there were some Akitu celebrations that were connected to Enlil, but also to Marduk. This is also what's fun about Assyriology, is that new pieces of the puzzle constantly appear. When it comes to kings, there's evidence of different kings visiting Nippur during the Akitus at around the time of the beginning of the new year. Last but not least, when we look at the names of people that were living at that time, we see many names that have the words Akitu in them or the name Marduk. So in a nutshell, with the red pill, we know that something was going on in Babylon at the time of the new year, because when the Assyrians captured the city, they described some sort of ritual that was taking place there and that involved Marduk and the king. And we know that after that, when the Babylonians got rid of the Assyrians and the Elamites and got their Marduk statue back, there are growing mentions of Akitu rituals related to Marduk in Babylon and in other towns in the area, and notably in Nippur, that was an important religious center. So something was going on. There's something going on at the new year. There's something related to this Marduk Akitu going on. So then the main question is to try and understand how the New Year ritual, this Marduk-related Akitu, was connected to the Enuma Elish myth, and that was celebrated at the spring equinox, gradually managed to become the main Akitu celebration, superseding local ones and superseding the autumn equinox ones. But anyway, one thing is certain here is that the Assyrians themselves were gradually more and more interested in this Marduk-related New Year festival, in its mythology and in its corresponding rituals. And actually, the Assyrians were so interested in the Enuma Elish that they rewrote some copies of it, strategically rewriting the text and writing their own god Ashur into it, giving him the lead role. And quite ironically, the Babylonian New Year ritual seems to have reached some sort of climax, not during the days of the aforementioned different Babylonian historical periods, but during the Neo-Assyrian period. So now that we know about the Babylonian calendar, about the Babylonian creation myth, and about the ritual, let's look at what the Assyrians made of all this, how they reworked all this in their own mythology, in their own state rituals. When the Neo-Assyrian period started, it was already functioning with the Babylonian calendar that begins at the spring equinox. There was another important Assyrian ceremony attested in the Middle Assyrian period, and that is the king's coronation ceremony. This coronation is often said to have happened once or twice a year, with one of these likely being the new year. This coronation ceremony brought together many members of the political elite and the religious elite in the person of the highest priest of Ashur and other cultic personnel. It was a fundamental moment where the entire social order was reapproved and everybody accepted and renewed their position. Many scholars mentioned that this coronation must have taken place at the new year in the Middle Assyrian period, but nobody states that this connection is certain. There's a lot of uncertainty in Assyriology. It can be quite daunting. Because of the obvious continuity between the Middle Assyrian and the Neo-Assyrian period, there are reasons to believe that the Neo-Assyrians' coronations, so coronations of the king, were also part of a New Year ritual, or at least that some sequences of it were repeated during the New Year, like having the political personnel and the vassal kings renewing their oaths of loyalty. The Neo-Assyrian Empire started off quite small, centered around the city of Ashur, but it then started to expand, regaining the territories lost by the Middle Assyrian Empire that are often referred to as Assyria proper. So this went on between the 11th century and the 9th century. Then there's a phase of important expansion in the second half of the 8th century under the reigns of Tiglath-Pileser III and Sargon II, must have heard of Sargon, when the Assyrian kings conquered new lands outside Assyria proper, creating new provinces and establishing an empire that stretched north to the Taurus Mountains, west to the Mediterranean, east to the Zagros Mountain, and all the way down south, incorporating Babylon and the southern marches. Now, there are different phases of conflict between the Assyrian kings and the cities and regions of Babylon, which was integrated in the empire and then lost again on several occasions. It's exactly during this phase of expansion and creation of new provinces that the interest of the Assyrian kings for the Babylonian ritual seems to really pick up, with King Sargon II and his successors, usually referred to as the Sargonids. Scholars usually suggest that the important growth of the administrative machine, the growing body of administrators, the never-seen-before expansion of the territory created new needs of political legitimization. The kings needed to stitch the different parts of the empire together in cultic networks and produce some sort of ideological unity. And this is precisely why scholars think that they developed a strong interest for the Babylonian New Year. King Tiglath-Pileser III is said to have participated in the New Year ritual in Babylon for 2 consecutive years. The next king, King Sung II, spent about 3 years in Babylon around 710 BCE and participated in the ritual and even took the hand of Bel, so Marduk. He developed a great interest for how the cultic network is run and seemingly, according to later kings, ordered the construction of Akitu temples back in Assyria proper. But the real coup d'etat happens when King Sennacherib, so 704-681 BCE, suddenly becomes a great New Year enthusiast. But his relationship with the city and the people of Babylon is actually quite complex. He had appointed his son, the crown prince, as king of Babylon, but he got himself executed in a rebellion. So Sennacherib ordered the sack of the city, which is recorded as being super violent and merciless. So he's at once remembered as sacking the city and causing important damage, but also as the one who really pushed for the importation of the Babylonian New Year ritual and its ideology into Neo-Assyrian politics. Sennacherib does something extremely radical here. He actually alters the ground plans of the main Ashur temple, which is a huge thing. He installs a firmament gate. So the firmament gate makes its appearance in this main Ashur temple. So the main temple of their deity, like the main temple of the empire. A firmament gate makes its appearance that opens towards the rising sun in the east. It would have held the days of destiny, which we know was such a fundamental element of the New Year mythology. Sennacherib builds an Akitu house outside the city gates and describes his project in detail. And what's really interesting in his inscriptions is that he downplays these innovations, saying that the tradition had existed in previous times and that it had been forgotten by his predecessors. So as far as he's concerned, he's just restoring something that had actually already existed. His son Esarhaddon continues in this direction, and one notable thing is that this king chooses the month of Nisan, the beginning of the year, to make his subordinates take the loyalty oath in favor of his own son Ashurbanipal, which points to the fact that the new year was gradually becoming a platform for reaffirming the political system and announcing important decisions. They were, by now, various Akitu temples in different cities of the empire, not only in Ashur. In those other Neo-Assyrian cities, the Akitu temples are not always linked to the main god Ashur, but they are linked to the main god of each city, and the festivities didn't all take place at the new year, which poses again the question of the place of these Akitu, these new year policies, in the strategic structuration of the imperial cultic network. Because we seem to have some centralizing dynamics going on with festivities happening in the capital cities and rituals taking place in the temple of Ashur, but we also have some sort of circuit of Akitu temples devoted to other gods and that the kings visited to take part in specific rituals, or sometimes they sent their clothes to participate in the rituals instead of going themselves, which is quite a fun thing to do, I find. These circuits have been pointed out as having important military implications, and the cultic activity would then have served to strengthen bonds with areas of the empire that needed more attention. These different lines of investigations all point to the fact that the New Year ritual and the various celebrations of Akitus in other cities had the objective of strengthening the bonds of the different types of elites and integrating the different territories into a symbolic whole. But it's not all about symbols, because there are some attestations that tax exemptions were declared during the Akitus and that debt cancellations might have been proclaimed when a new king was installed. And these aspects, I feel, are still sadly understudied. Because if we accept that at some point the intronization of kings was part of the New Year sequence and that people were renewing their oath and strengthening the bonds, then we need to look beyond the cultic stuff of this theological reform and look at the proper socio-economic aspects of the Spring Equinox New Year rituals. What does it mean that important fiscal decisions were taken during the ritual? What does it mean that wide-scale debt cancellations might have been issued at that time? And how does this dialogue with the theological content of the ritual, with the claims that the ritual reaffirms the legitimacy of the king as the rightful shepherd of his people, as the one who guarantees justice and protection? What is the days of destiny really about? What sort of fate were the gods really decreeing? What sort of projection into the future was going on? What sort of decisions were taken and announced? In a nutshell, what are the fiscal and economic aspects of the new year? But again, bear with me, Before I talk about economics and the equilibrium of the social fabric, I need to take us on a walk in the cosmos. So next slide, please. The New Year ritual takes place at the spring equinox that is associated with the idea of new beginnings. Now, the Mesopotamians kept track of time by observing the movement of celestial bodies, the sun, the stars, and the moon. As we saw in the standard Babylonian calendar, adopted during the Middle Assyrian period at the turn of the second and first millennium, the year begins at the spring equinox. When the NeoAssyrian period begins, this calendar is already in use. It has 12 months, and ideally, the first day of the month coincides with the equinox. Now, this leads to specific practices in the astronomical field. Next slide, please. So throughout the first millennium BCE, all the lists of stars and constellations that we have, they always begin with those who rise at the spring equinox. See, so these up here. It says, in the months of Nisan, this star and that star appeared. In the months of Nisan, this star and that star appeared. Next slide, please. But the spring equinox, so the spring equinox is associated with the idea of beginning. You see, they use the spring equinox to do their lists of stars, and it's always thought to be the beginning. But the spring equinox is also associated with the idea of balance and centrality. The equinoxes are a moment of balance between day and night. Ancient astronomers informed the king about the state of the cosmos by writing letters. If you have a moment, you need to go and check out the state archives of Assyria online with all the correspondence of the Neo-Assyrian administration. It's just delightful. It's actually quite hilarious at times. So you see here we have an ancient astronomer who's writing on the 6th of Nisan, the day and the night were in balance. 6 double hours of daylight, 6 double hours of night. Now, this balance of day and night, of course, is due to the sun's ecliptic. And in Mesopotamian celestial topography, the equinoxes are in a position of centrality. They happen in the middle of the path of Anu, and the path of Anu itself being the central pathways of the sky. So you see, when I was saying you can't talk about astronomical theory without talking about religion, it's because the way that they see the cosmos is already, they have a very religious reading of this cosmos. So basically, the spring equinox, astronomically speaking, is associated with the idea of balance and centrality. But equinoxes are also moments of calibration and re-equilibration. The Mesopotamians used the moon to determine the months. But this creates important problems in timekeeping because 12 moon cycles, can we have the next slide, please? Oh, yes, wonderful. But this creates important problems in timekeeping because 12 moon cycles do not exactly equate to solar year. And every now and then, basically, you become totally desynchronized. So every now and then, you need to add a month to let the solar year catch up. And these intercalations always happen at the equinoxes. You see here, we have a letter from an astronomer who's saying to the king, let them intercalate months. All the stars of the sky have fallen behind. Adar 12 must not pass unfavorably. So you see, I'm trying to say here is that the spring equinox was associated to beginnings, to balance and equilibrium of the cosmos, but also to the idea of calibration and of re-equilibration. Next slide, please. Wonderful. So the New Year ritual takes place around the spring equinox that's associated with new beginnings, but also with the idea of balance and equilibrium of the cosmos. It's the moment where the state realigns human time and cosmic time, re-equilibrating its timekeeping practices. Next slide, please. So let's now turn to the socioeconomic field. What were the social representation, beliefs, and practices associated with the new year in the socioeconomic field? My idea here was to look into what was going on at the time of the new year in the socioeconomic field. One important thing to say here is that Assyriologists and Assyriological literature usually say that the new year used to be an agricultural festival, but by the time we get to the first millennium, it no longer is an agricultural festival. And no one really says why everyone says that, but it's like this really strong idea in the field of Assyriology. So next slide, please. And let's ease that transition between the socioeconomic and the astronomical field. So all the stars that appear at the spring equinox, the constellations that appear at the spring equinox belong to the semantic field of agriculture and animal husbandry. You see the plough, the hired worker, and the field. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I looked into agriculture and I focused on barley, which is like a staple cereal, which was so fundamental for these empires. Now, the New Year ritual happens at the junction of two agricultural cycles. In some fields, the barley is ripening, marking the end of an agricultural cycle. And in other fields, seeds are soon to be planted, marking the beginning of a new agricultural cycle. I've just realized that I forgot to say to you that the new year, like the month one, falls in our calendar at like the end of March, beginning of April. I think it's important when we start talking about agricultural cycles. So in some fields, the barley is ripening, marking the end of an agricultural cycle. And in other fields, seeds are soon planted, marking the beginning of an agricultural cycle. Water management at this time of the year is crucial. Farmers need to control floods some fields and not others. Poor management can be disastrous. Locusts can also destroy your crops. And this is a moment of tension as there's still a risk of crop failure. So basically, if you see here, on the drawing here, we see that the ritual actually happens during the hunger gap, in a moment where farmers are running out of grain. Mesopotamian societies have storage economies, so grain reserves are always at their lowest right before the harvest. This means that the ritual happens during the hunger gap, when barley is scarce and price is high. So basically, the ritual happens at the time of the hunger gap. The hunger gaps in agricultural societies have specific sociological properties. They're moments of intensified reciprocity that can be positive, but that also can be negative. Now, we have a big clay trail, what we call a clay trail, lots of tablets that tell us about the negative reciprocity and the numerous depth notes that people, the asymmetrical relations that people entered at the specific time of the year. Lean periods were moments where people were in danger of dramatic shifts of their social status. They had to ask for loans of grains that they exposed themselves and the members of their families to the destructive dynamics of raw usury. The richer strata of the society could use this lean period to increase, next slide please, to increase its economic capital and secure more dependence in the near future. By lending grain to a household, they put a foot in the door, installing an antagonistic relationship that could lead to members of that family being pledged and gaining more dependence in the future. So next slide, please. Now, high levels of dependency are not good news for the state because it threatens the balance of power inside the society, creating powerful households that the state then has trouble to deal with. Now, Mesopotamian societies were fundamentally unequal, and social justice never means the equality of conditions in the Mesopotamian worldview. The state needs a specific configuration of social inequality in a way to be able to rule the territory, because its power ultimately rests on the elite social groups to whom it's constantly giving tax cuts and all sorts of exemptions. Next slide, please. But there is a tipping point here that the state must beware not to cross. If some households absorbed too many others and private domains became too powerful, then the state loses its capacity to tax people directly and to exploit their workforce in the corvée system. So it's not exactly as if they didn't want social, inequality because they thought it was unjust and poor people who were poor. There's also a strategic thing that they need to make sure that they can still tax people when the households don't become too big and powerful. And when we remember that some of the big landowners were themselves members of the state, then the acrobatic exercise is revealed in all its dimension. So basically, the idea is that the ritual happens during the hunger gap, where people are experiencing dramatic shifts, sometimes dramatic shifts of social position, where these antagonistic social relations were being weaved between people. And this cannot have been something that didn't preoccupy the state, because the state needs a specific configuration of social relations in order to be able to actually administer the territory. It can't be completely blind to the dynamics that are going on in the countryside. Now, what was happening after the harvest? Next slide, please. Debts are repaid at the threshing ground. But that's not all. The social organization of both agricultural production and animal husbandry are multi-leveled in ancient Mesopotamia, like in so many places. Mesopotamian societies were fundamental unequal societies, and contra the Oriental despotism idea, lands and herds were privately owned, and land was often farmed out. So state taxation, civic or religious institutions happens right after the harvest. Private resource extraction practices also happen right after the harvest. And the harvest marks the general movement of wealth up the social structure, from farmers to landlords, and then sometimes from landlords to state, or directly from farmers to state. Actually, whatever the social organization of production is in a specific time or place, where wealth always travels upwards at that time of the year. So the harvest marks the moment of balancing the accounts between tenants and landlords and state authority, and the subsequent renewal of public and private land tenure contracts. It's the same for shepherding contracts. So after the harvest, debts are repaid, accounts are settled, public and private granaries are filled, new contracts reaffirm and consolidate the social order. Wealth travels up the social structure. So in conclusion of this exploration of the socioeconomic field, I will say that if we want to have a thick understanding of the political functions of the ritual, we need to look at its relation with the agricultural and taxation cycles. Next slide, please. Super. The investigation of the socioeconomic fields shows that the ritual happens in a period of scarcity and extreme polarization of social positions. The lean period, the hunger gap, is a major moment of creation of asymmetrical social relations that, past a certain tipping point, actually becomes a threat to the state's capacity to actually rule the territory. This is the economic background of the New Year celebration, and it is against this background that the fiscal decisions that were taken and announced at the New Year should be analysed. Next slide, please. My idea is that there is a set of fiscal tools, so debt cancellations and privileges for the elites, that can help restore the social fabric to an ideal configuration, a balanced social order that allows the state to administer the population. And this fundamental fiscal aspect of New Year rituals has to be taken into account, but it also has to be read against the theological background of cosmic balance and order. So let's look at the religious field again now with these new elements in mind. So next slide, please. If we consider the ties of reciprocity that sustain Mesopotamian political power, then we can suggest that the ritual plays a role in the legitimization of resource extraction. The ritual could have been a symbolic device by which the political elite legitimized taxation and resource extraction, like the ritual conceived as a gift that calls for a counter-gift. So that's maybe one way of looking at things. But there's also another suggestion that can be made after this exploration of the socioeconomic field. Next slide, please. So I think that the exploration of the socioeconomic fields allows us to decode the theology at the heart of the New Year ritual. The ritual happens at a time of increased social tensions and downward social mobility, and before the reaffirmation of social positions and contracts. The Enuma Elish, that's central to the celebration of the New Year, talks about a pretty dramatic cosmic battle and the subsequent installation of the highest god as chief of the pantheon. A hypothesis here could be that the religious discourse and symbolism at the heart of the Mesopotamian New Year ritual is a transfiguration of phenomena proper to the astronomical and socioeconomic fields. The social instability, the too polarized state of social relations, inspired the story told in the Enuma Elish. It is the social struggle, next slide please, it is the social struggle, not the cosmic struggle. It is the social chaos, not the cosmic chaos, that the myth talks about and that the ritual actually intends to fight. Now, some concluding remarks. Next slide please. Wonderful. So I hope that by now you understand my title better, Symbolic Acrobatics and Economic Phenomena in Early Mesopotamian States, Balancing Calendars, Stars, Gods, Debts and Social Structures in the First Millennium BCE. The New Year is a ritual device destined to ensure the social and political equilibrium of the society through practical fiscal decision on debts and taxes that impact the social structures and modify the balance between the different social groups and between the state and these different social groups. These proper political aspects lean on a strong ideological and cultic device in which the king reassures his bonds with the gods and his divine mission to provide collective well-being. We need a deep and multi-leveled understanding of these fiscal policies implemented by the successive states at the time of the New Year. This will allow us to look at the ritual beyond its symbolic aspects to grasp the complex power balancing of social groups, an exercise in acrobatics that's fundamental for the survival of the state. If debt cancellations were really proclaimed at this point, or if the doors of the royal granaries were open to the more fragile layers of the population, the king would have been perfectly aligned with his supposed divine mission to look after his people and provide social justice. But of course, the idea is never to create an egalitarian society, because debt, bondage, slavery, and rural usury were never forbidden per se. The logic of the system is not questioned. It is just the balance that's adjusted. Because as my talk aims to show, the New Year rituals is all about equilibriums.